well, you're looking great. Thanks for joining me here on my podcast.
Yeah, you bet.
We've
You
been having a
bet.
blast reliving old memories with good friends.
Yeah, no, it's been great. It's been great watching them and remembering things that I had long forgotten
Yeah, oh, wow.
with some other people. No surprise there, but yeah, no, it's fabulous that you're revisiting just an amazing time in certainly my life, and I'm sure yours too. So it
Oh,
was very formative.
yeah, it was an amazing time in TV news. When we were there, we were doing this for about a 20-year period, transitioning from an old school film life into videotape live reporting, the expansion of news outside of just 5 and 11 live things. Um,
Right.
and and I always thought that at least for the most part while we were there, uh, the importance of storytelling was very far in the front,
Yeah.
and I know that changed over time, but I mean I know you were a great storyteller. You had to love those times.
Oh, I did love them. And you're right. We had certainly when I was at KGW and, before KGW, I was in Eugene for a few years and then a little tiny market of Eureka, California. But you're absolutely right. There was a focus on good writing and good storytelling. And at KGW, of course, in collaboration with our videographers. And that, you're right, that was in the forefront. Whereas it transitioned at some point to more a focus on, well, don't go longer than a minute 30, or give me a 30-second, piece of a story. And it became, as you know, became more about quantity than it did about quality. And I mean, there's still some good quality work going on out there, and I see it from time to time. But yeah, we went through that transition,
Yeah.
and
And
and as you remember, Carl, and you referenced it. There was a morning show, a brief one, and when I first came in, there were no noon shows, and there was a 5 o'clock show, I think, and 11 o'clock show, and then of course now it's wall to wall. And boy, one of the local stations has a newscast on. It seems like 24 hours a day.
yeah, it's kind of the CNN of Portland. Yeah,
Right.
and I hesitate to judge people or journalism because it is a representation of the time you're in,
Right.
and the people that are doing it now are doing what they need to do to keep it corporately effective
Yeah.
and technologically uh, up to the standard of what's going on. The end of my career, we got into so much social media. It changed from the story you were telling to how quickly can you get something on your social media page so that you can
Right.
attract attention and get hits and bring hopefully people to the newscast. That was a bigger transition at the end.
Yeah, no, you're right. We were there through the technological revolution. I mean, I remember I have a photo of myself that one of our old videographers, Tim Herman, took while I was on a road trip with him. It's a black and white photo, and I'm sitting in the satellite truck somewhere, typing a story on a typewriter, right? And right with carbon paper in the typewriter, right? As I say when I talk to people about that and I show them that photo, that was long ago in a galaxy far away. But and I can still remember those first computers coming into the KGW newsroom. Our old friend Jeff Douglas, who was the executive producer, kind of introduced those into the newsroom. And I didn't realize it at the time, but it was revolutionary and it changed everything we did. And the internet now makes everything just so immediate. And that's why, as you say, you've got to get out there on your show. You can't wait till the newscast.
No kidding.
Can't wait to write that story. You've got to get it out there because you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of other competing outlets looking for eyeballs on that same story. So yeah, we were lucky. We were there at a time when we were able to spend a little bit more time cultivating our stories and writing them.
And you mentioned a road trip. Uh, I've been away long enough now. I've been away 7 years, but we used to go places and spend the time to do things. I mean, I just saw something on the web reliving Ann Curry's news career in Portland. She went to Nicaragua with Kevin Feltz, and John Tuttle went to China and Vietnam. I interviewed Mike Donahue. He went to China with the governor. And we worked for King Broadcasting, which was not afraid to
Right.
spend money to send people.
Right.
What places did you go? Do you remember on great stories?
Well, I didn't, to be honest, I didn't travel a lot when I was at KGW. I traveled a lot after KGW, but I didn't the primary big trip I took was I did cover the war in Kosovo. I went along with Mercy Corps.
Oh,
So
yeah. Again, what a great example of
yeah, yeah,
connecting with a local agency and
right.
telling a world story.
Right. And that was really an eye-opening and life-changing experience for me, just because I was in refugee camps. And
Oh,
the story, I mean, the biggest impression that was left on me is I remember sitting in a Mercy Corps office in Macedonia, and I was talking to a Kosovar who had fled the situation in Kosovo and had made it with his family to this office. And I'm talking to the guy, and he's telling me about all of these terrible things that he and his family had gone through to make it there. And I said, "So what did you do there?" And he said, "Oh, I was a surgeon in Kosovo." And I thought, what struck me was, I thought to myself, if this guy was in Portland, Oregon right now, he'd be making a lot of money and have this amazing career and would be probably a pillar of the community. And this guy has been forced, to flee his home and flee his country and, in essence, live in a refugee camp with his family. So it just made me appreciate how lucky we are
yeah.
to live where we are, and at the time do what we do and have the benefits we have. And it just gave me an appreciation for the struggles other people have. And as you and I knew a lot, we saw that at a local level.
Yeah.
We covered a lot of stories of people who were far more disadvantaged than us. And that was one of the great things about being in that business, I think, is it always gave you perspective on your own life as it relates to what's going on out there in the world and in the community.
Which is, one of the great things about journalism is it does affect you,
Yeah.
and it moves you, and then if you do it right, it moves others.
Right. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
the opportunity to do that in the forum that we were working, and the fact that they sent you where they went. Who went with you, by the way? Do you remember the photographer?
Brian Robertson
What a great
was
guy.
the videographer who went with me.
I love
Yeah.
Brian. I still
Yeah.
I still see Brian on Facebook. He's working for the school district, and there's
Yeah.
a guy who was a good shooter, like all the guys we worked with, and women who were videographers, and it was just a blast to be around.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'll tell you a quick story. So we went to Macedonia, then we took this torturous trip over into Albania because there were more refugee camps over there. So we're in Albania, and the Mercy Corps guy who took us over there had to go do something else. So we had to figure out how to get back to Macedonia, because ultimately we were going to go home. And so we hired an Albanian cab driver. Well, the Macedonians don't like the Albanians. They're like this. And so at one point we went through a checkpoint with Macedonian soldiers with the equivalent of AK-47 rifles. And they pulled the Albanian guy out of the car. They pulled us out of the car. And you could nobody could communicate because the Albanian couldn't speak English or Macedonian. The Macedonians none of us could speak the same language. They were doing whatever they did to interrogate this guy, which was a challenge because they didn't speak the same language. And they were looking at us very suspiciously. And at one point they opened up the trunk, and Brian in his little suitcase had a novel by Tom Clancy that he had been reading. He had taken on the flight and was reading, and they picked it up and they were looking at it very suspiciously and looking at us. I don't know if they thought it was some, manifesto or something that was going against what they thought or what they were doing. And he's looking at it. And Brian at one point says, so you've read Tom Clancy before. The wrong and then the guy looks at us, and I kind of elbow Brian and say, Brian,
no.
Brian. Yeah, so that really kind of captures the spirit of Brian Robertson.
Yeah, in the
always a guy,
interrogation and machine guns, he's going, hey, let's sit down and do a book group.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. So no, it was an amazing experience, and you mentioned it. We were just fortunate to work with some of the best videographers in the business, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Not only at KGW, but even more broadly.
Let's see. You came from Eugene.
Yeah.
Did you at any point anchor the morning news? And I know you did the noon news a little bit.
Yeah, I did.
You did the morning shift a little bit?
Yeah, I did. I came to KGW in 1988, hired by our friend and the person you interviewed, Regan Ramsey.
Yeah.
And still to this day, extremely thankful for him for acknowledging my talent and finding me in a sea of 3/4-inch resume tapes.
Yep.
And pulling me up here. So I started, and I actually in 88, and by the end of 88, I was anchoring the morning show. You may recall our friend Nancy Francis went on maternity leave. She had one of her children. And so they had me fill in for her when she went on maternity leave. So I started anchoring with Sharon Mitchell. And so Sharon and I anchored the morning show and the noon show for, I don't know how long it was, maybe a year or so together. And then, kind of all hell broke loose when they sold the station and new management and a new news director came in, and I was no longer on I was pulled off of the morning show. I think you can relate to being pulled off a show unceremoniously, but I was pulled off the morning show at that point, morning and noon. But then I continued to anchor. I anchored every different show at some point or another, and was.
You were the utility infielder of anchoring newscasts.
Yes, I was. Yeah, if they needed somebody to fill in at the last minute because somebody got sick or something, they would yank me in and say, "Hey, do this show."
That's a great skill to have, though, and you get it the way that you did. It's like, hey, we need somebody to fill in for somebody, and you do it, and you get the skill, and you get the anchor, and then people know that you can do that part of the job. And then, I mean, that's how I got my anchor job, basically, was I'd done some anchoring of sports, and, somebody was gone on a weekend, and I said, I'll do it. And I'd never anchored a newscast in my life. I've always given scores and highlights. Got a little bit of skill, and I said, hey, thanks for doing that. Can you do the morning next week? And, and over time, if you do it well, and you find you land in a spot that hopefully works out for you. Then later on, we created this 4 o'clock newscast, which was a big deal. And you got
first at 4.
First at 4, yeah.
First at 4.
You got assigned that with you and Kathy Smith, right?
Right. Yeah. That was. And I don't know if you know, it only lasted 9 months.
Oh, I do know that, Larry, because I remember Dennis Williamson was our general manager at that point, who's a neighbor of mine, by the way, up here in Blackview Ranch. And I remember the speech in the newsroom about we're in this for the long haul. And Channel 6 had done a 4 o'clock newscast about a year prior to that, and it didn't last. And I kind of was a little skeptical. But I remember the speech and they've hired a lot of people. I think they hired your wife. They hired Rosie.
They did. The good news about that show was I got a wife out of the deal.
Yeah. So we were on at 4 o'clock, and the idea was that, news watchers would then lead into the 5 o'clock. But 9 months was it.
Yeah, 9 months. And it was a wild ride for 9 months. And what I mean by that is you may recall, they gave us an immense amount of freedom on that show. Their idea was have some fun with it, be irreverent. We did this weird thing. You remember Wayne Bleasner, longtime producer, God rest his soul. He passed away a few months ago. And he would sit in what we called the feed room, right? And he would take in all these feeds from NBC and CNN and these different sources that we would use to create stories that we would put on our newscasts. And we had this thing we called Wayne's World, and we would just go back to Wayne.
Hey, what'd you find today?
Yeah. What's going on the feeds today, Wayne? Did you find anything interesting? And Wayne would say, well, yeah, there's this bizarre story from Australia, and he'd show kangaroos or something, you know.
And the cool part about that is Wayne was not a broadcaster. He didn't have a broadcaster's voice. He was kind of, you know, a little bit slow and talked to things. So it was so different from a newscast. This Wayne's World thing kind of flipped the page. It was funny.
Yeah, and I remember another memory from that show is, and I don't remember all the details, but we always teased the 5 o'clock. So at 4:45 or whatever, we'd go back to Pete Schulberg sitting at that little set in the newsroom. And I remember one time we went back to Pete. And I don't know if he didn't have his microphone on, something wasn't working with the microphone, and he's talking and we're not hearing anything. And Kathy and I just looked back at the camera and said, hold on. Hey, can somebody get Pete a microphone? And so somebody, we literally sat there in silence for like 30 seconds while somebody grabbed Pete a microphone. And then Kathy said, start again, Pete. What's going on at 5? So it was that kind of show.
Yeah.
It was that, and it was really fun for that period of time, but they didn't let it develop long enough, I think, to really get a following and be a moneymaker.
And it might have been a victim of Oprah at Channel 2.
Yeah.
Because that was about the time that she was coming out and she got real big. And so trying to compete with that. And so eventually we stole Oprah from Channel 2 and got it to Channel 8.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That was a big deal.
Yeah.
We signed the contract with Oprah, and then that became the big lead in. And, you can certainly debate all that happened around Oprah and follow Oprah follow-on stories and stuff, but it certainly helped. It gave us a bigger audience going into the 5 o'clock show. So
thinking about that 4 o'clock, they hired your wife Rosie. Tom was the consumer reporter specifically for the show. And then I remembered, Larry, they hired a whole bunch of other people because that's the same time that we started doing news cut-ins on CNN, and we were doing them like every hour. We would do those things. So they hired a whole bunch of producers. I think Joe Arndt was one of those, so that they would produce those. So every hour, one of our anchors was sitting at that desk and doing a 3 or 4 minute update that they plugged into the CNN there on the cable. And but a lot of those people lost their jobs 9 months later, unfortunately.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to go back to quickly, you mentioned the utility infielder role I played. I don't know if you remember, I also did weather there and I did sports there. Just fill in. I remember I saw your interview with Jim Little, by the way. That was great to see him again. And he went on vacation or something, and the weekend weather guy had just left to go somewhere else. And we were in a newsroom meeting and somebody said, anybody around here know how to do weather? And I said, well, I've done weather before. And of course I had started my career doing weather when, you had a plexiglass board with a map and you drew clouds on it and put sticky numbers on it. So I actually did weather there a few times and did sports on the weekends a couple of times. You were probably on vacation or something at the time, and and Becker.
Now that you mention the weather, I do remember that, for a week and a half or something like that. And again, that's another skill that makes you a valuable employee. You can, I remember that a while back, Keely Chalmers, they threw her into weather, and all of a sudden she was doing weekend weather. I mean, it's job security when you're a utility infielder. So in our exchanges to set this up, I mentioned a series that I remember you doing that you may not remember. I wanted to talk to you about because I think it has relevance now. Do you remember Shades of Grey?
I don't. I hate to say it, Carl. I hate to say it. The title jogged a little. There's a neuron in there somewhere that contains that, but I don't remember. shades of gray.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I remember this is the way my brain works, is I
Yeah.
remember things that happened as far as where we were. And this happened while we were in that temporary newsroom in the studio A or Studio B,
Yeah.
where we had all
Yeah.
the tables
Oh,
lined
right.
up around, because for about 2 months we were remodeling and redoing. And so
Right.
I just remember, there was some TVs where we watched it. I remember watching your stories, and the best I can remember is it was a series about race in Portland, where you interviewed a lot of African Americans or people of color, a lot of them who were older, just to try to get a perspective of how race had changed in Portland over time. And I think the Shades of Gray title had to do with the fact that those of us who are white looking at an issue of color, we have one perspective. People who are of color looking at how they're being treated have another. So you've got these two different colors coming together. And I think, the way you presented was it's kind of a gray area because we all have different perspectives. So.
Yeah. And, you had mentioned in your emails to me that, what is that perspective now?
Yeah.
And how would I view that same situation today? And I'd like to be able to tell you that I think we have made a lot of progress there, but in some ways I'm concerned we haven't. And it's a challenging situation as I look across the country, and even in Portland. Portland's still predominantly a white place. And boy, you look at since I came to the market, the whole gentrification situation over in North and Northeast Portland, where a lot of traditional, wonderful Black neighborhoods and Black communities have been pushed out because those neighborhoods are close into the city. And all of a sudden they became desirable for people who were more affluent and with more money. And so in some ways, I'm hopeful, because I'm an optimistic, hopeful guy there. I am glad to see the conversation really being a conscious conversation now, as opposed to a kind of a subconscious thought process.
A gray area.
Yeah. So it's still very much shades of gray. And, the questions you and I need to ask each other are, as relatively privileged white people and as relatively privileged white men, what's our role in all this? And how can we make an impact and make some change on what's going on out there in the world and in our community?
Well, and I looked back at my career as a news person and a feature reporter. I know that I didn't have a great impact on that. I was a little bit naive and oblivious to some of those things, and talking with some of our colleagues like Lou Frederick, and I've had some conversations with Sharon Mitchell about it. I was so unaware of how things were working. So
Yeah.
I didn't have an impact on that part of our community when I was doing some reporting. Here's another one I wanted to bring up. I hope you remember this conversation. If not, oh, by the way, so in my memory, if we go back to the archives of KGW someday, those clipboards that used to have all the dates when things, aired. It would have been in late '89 or early '90 when you did that, because that's when we were in that transition from from those two studios. So someday we'll get back in there and we'll find it and see how good you were at predicting.
So that is indeed long ago in a galaxy far away.
And what I remember again about where I was and what things were happened was in like February or March of '90, we were back into that remodeled newsroom and stood and looked at a monitor and watched us attack Baghdad. In my mind, I can picture where I was standing when I watched things happen. So here's a conversation you and I had, and I hope you remember it, because I think we missed the boat on this, Larry. At one point, you and I discussed doing a story, more of a feature story, together, two reporters on one story. Do you remember that?
Okay. Yeah, I do.
And we thought, well, let's find the story, and then we can tell it. I would tell one part of it, you would tell another part, and they would come together. Not something goofy like I'd do a stand up and turn to Larry, but just but two people, two storytellers combining to tell a story. So you do remember that conversation?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
good. Well, we never did it, but
No.
I'm telling you, man, I think we should have, and I think now looking back, that could have become a huge franchise. We could have taken that show on the road. You know,
Yeah.
what if Charles Kuralt and Bob Dotson started doing stories together, and
Right.
we'd had to find the right stories, but to sit down and write something together with and with working with different photographers, I just it was a great idea. We didn't finish it, Larry.
Yeah. And my guess is, I don't remember exactly when we had that conversation, but I bet it was post Regan Ramsey.
Oh, sure.
Because if Regan was there, we would have just run to his office, and I guarantee you he would have said, try it.
Oh, yeah.
If it doesn't work, we won't do it again. But Carl, Larry, give it a shot. What the hell?
I think I remember the story I had done that led us to that conversation. I did it with the great Milt Ritter, and it was about a guy whose job it was to paint. He painted storefront signs, those big, 50% off and things like that. And he was an independent contractor, and he would go to one store, he would paint things, and he was a great artist. And we had done that, and you and I talked about having done that together, or find something like that to do together. So
yeah, that concept of putting together two good feature reporters and looking at something from your unique and different perspectives and figuring out a way to knit that together. That's what we were talking about doing. Yeah. So, interestingly, speaking of the great Milt Ritter, you did a story with Milt Ritter that is one of the most memorable stories you ever did when I was at KGW. Do you have any idea what that one might be? It was in the most confined space you can think of.
Riding elevators.
Riding elevators. Riding elevator. It was a classic example. If you went to some of our news directors and you had said, "Hey, I'm going to go do a story about people riding up and down in elevators," they would have said, "Sorry, go cover this trial, or look at the police blotter." But you guys did this brilliant story of what it was like. In essence, it was the etiquette, right, and it was the diplomacy and all those things of riding. And did you do it in Big Pink?
Yes.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, both Milt and I were almost sick to our stomachs after we'd gone up and down that elevator so much.
I'll bet.
But it was
brilliant.
Thank you. And you don't do anything with Milt Ritter that wasn't brilliant. It was about where you stood as you divided the elevator when you came up, that you didn't talk, that you looked at the numbers, and it was about a physicality.
Well, and as I recall, it was, depending on how many people are in the elevator, this is the dynamic, and where they look and where they don't look, and it was just wonderful.
Well, thank you. That's not one that I have. I have a few that are online. I think I might have it on a DVD. So if I'll try to find it. It's gonna involve an attic trip.
Yeah.
Spacing is always important. Whenever possible, people divide the space equally. 2 people split the car in half, and with more people, determining proper spacing gets more complicated.
I don't know. It's funny though. You watch people, and they'll get in the corners, then they'll get in the front, and then maybe they'll get in the middle.
Once properly spaced,
they look at the numbers.
It's true, everyone watches the numbers. And this is an important rule, because those we found not watching the numbers almost got off on the wrong floor. Those rules are there for a reason. And then there's the rule about not talking to strangers on an elevator.
We're wondering why people don't talk to people on the elevator.
It is funny, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a great. Speaking of Milt Ritter, one of the, all of us, I think, who worked with him had the wonderful opportunity to do some unique, different stories. Milt and I did a story one time where this probably was for First at 4. We knocked on people's doors in neighborhoods and asked them if we could come in and see their refrigerator magnets.
I remember that story, and it was awesome.
And they all let us in.
Hi, I'm Larry. This is Milt. We got a camera. We're just looking at what you got on your refrigerator. Come on in.
Yeah. And I mean, it had to be First at 4 because I can't imagine anybody else allowing us to do it, although Regan would have. But I mean, and and because of Milt's shooting and timing and all those things, it was just a brilliant piece on just this crazy concept
that everybody could relate to. And it actually told a story about the people and the family in that home.
Right. Exactly. And that was the concept, right? The concept is you can tell all you need to know about a person and a family based on the magnets on their refrigerator.
And I think as I remember that story, now that you mention it, I thought of a follow-up that I never did, and you guys probably should have done it, is you should have done the same thing about what's in people's junk drawers.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that'd be a great one.
The good scissors and all that kind of stuff. So, well, one of the things I want to tell you, Larry, is a couple things actually. But I came out of a sports background into news, and Phil Winstrand was the news director who allowed me to make that transition.
Right.
And I really came in just as a feature reporter, which was fine. That's what I love doing. But I think you were a great mentor to me because at some point I had to transition from just being a feature reporter to being a news reporter and a journalist. And I did that by watching you. We're close in age, but you were a little bit of a father figure because I felt like I came in as this really young, new reporter into a newsroom out of a sports department. And either by conversations that we had as friends and colleagues, or just by watching you, I think that helped me develop into a journalist, which I'm proud to say I became and was, but I wasn't when I was started. I was a sports reporter that could write good feature stories. And so I had to get from point A to point B. I really think that you helped me do that. I was glad you were in the newsroom for that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm humbled by that comment because I always looked at you as a really good journalist. And because I started in sports too, by the way, a very brief period of time in Eureka, California, where I started my career, because I went to Humboldt State University. I started my first job for a couple of months was weather. And then I transitioned to sports. And then I realized the math and the economics that, wow, I'm looking around and there are 10 times as many news people as there are sports people. So maybe it makes more sense to go into news. So I started there, and I actually started my writing in college and my reporting in TV around sports. And good writing and good reporting is good writing and reporting in any setting, whether it's in sports or whether it's in news. So I'm honored to say that I was some type of role model for you, but we could turn you loose on anything and you would put together a really good, solid piece, if not a highly memorable piece like riding up and down in elevators.
Well, I remember when they moved me into that, I was going to be doing feature stories. And then I remember when executive producer or producer, remember Cynthia Griffin, we were assigning things and I wasn't busy at the time, and they needed somebody to go cover a court case. And Cynthia wasn't aware of this deal I made that I'm going to do feature stories, and she sent me that direction, and I stuttered in front of her. I've never been in a courtroom. I believe Tim Herman was with me and baby stepped me through. It wasn't a complex case. It was just they were finishing things up, and I had to interview people leaving, but I was scared to death. My first court case.
Well, and my guess is, Carl, as you went through that experience and emerged out of that experience, you went, oh, the rules are the same. It's the 5 W's and an H. What's my lead? Yep. Throw in a quote. We're good to go.
It's the post-game interview of a Blazer game. It just happened to be coming out of a courtroom instead.
Well, and think about it, Carl. you and I both, you more than I, focused a lot on feature stories. That's actually a more challenging story to tell, in that a straight ahead news story, whether it's a court case or a city council meeting, that's really clear. I mean, this is what they're doing, and here are some sound bites, and here's what's going to happen next. A feature story, you can go in a multitude of different directions on that, and it's up to the reporter and the videographer to really figure out what's the best way to tell this story. And that's what was fun with those.
Yeah, and sometimes you didn't know what the story was until you got there.
Right.
I mean, you had an idea, here's what I'm going to get, and then you get there and all of a sudden there's this left turn, and that usually ends up being the gem.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I still coach a lot of people with what I'm doing now. But one of the things I talk about for people who are doing interviews is I talk about, you got to listen, because the majority of the time, the nugget, the what's going to really set this story apart is going to be something you didn't think about, and something that comes out of the interview, and something that somebody says where you go, oh, I'm going to follow that thread. And I'm going to get more into that. And there is my hook for this story.
And if you're worried about what next question you're going to ask because you have a list of questions and you didn't hear that, you missed it.
Exactly. That's why, I mean, there's a classic Ted Koppel interview years and years ago. By the way, who's still around doing stuff on CBS Sunday Morning. But Ted Koppel, and I think you and Walden may have touched on this, but he always said for his interviews on Nightline, they asked him how many questions. He prepared one question. Yeah. It was the opening question, and from there he listened. And it just evolved.
Yeah, and if you don't believe that, he's one of the greatest TV interviewers of all time with Nightline. So yeah. So you mentioned what you're doing now. You left KGW in 90-something, and you went to
2000.
2000. Okay, I'm sorry. 2000, and then you went to Intel, and you had a great career there. As you were director of their communications.
I was the director of employee communications. So the organization that does news and information sharing internally. I mean, Intel has an intranet site with news and information. Walden, our friend Walden, still works on that today.
You stole Walden away from us, but
I did. I stole Walden away. And I did, at the time, Intel had these quarterly meetings that were run by the CEO, where he would inform employees about things that were going on. And I always produced a video, kind of a news magazine, a 15-minute video for that, working with our friend Tim Herman, videographer at Channel 8, who I also stole. And so I did that. And then I ran this organization of, at one time, roughly 100 people worldwide, who were doing communications for employees in all these different parts of the world. And then that was for 13 years. And then the last 3 years, I left in 2016. The last 3 years, I ran what was called and is called the Executive Keynote Group. So it was the group that produced and put on stage all of the keynotes that the executives did at Consumer Electronics Show or other big events around the world, which was very cool, because what it did is it allowed me to leverage all of the broadcasting skills, because that, in essence, it's a presentation just like we did every day. It's creating and structuring a story. We did it in the time frame of 1:30 or 4 minutes. They're doing it in the time frame of 30 minutes or an hour. And because I had so much experience doing on-air stuff and in front of audiences, I was able to help them with their presentation skills at the same time. So yeah, it was a great career at Intel.
And did I'm guessing that was a pandemic affected here in the last year or so?
Well, for me, interestingly enough, no. So I left Intel in 2016 and I started my own company. Yeah. And my primary client is Intel, which has been wonderful. They say, hey, Larry, we need help on this keynote. We need help on some communications thing. And I assumed, Carl, that business was just going to fall off a cliff, but it has not. And the reason it has not is that in the pandemic, communications has become more important than ever. Not just writing stories or doing speeches, but just communication overall has become more important. And the one thing as former journalists that we often don't give ourselves enough credit for is we're really good at communicating, not just telling stories and not just writing a minute 30 story and weaving in video and interviews, but we're really good at understanding how to connect with people in a setting like this, for instance. And that's a skill that most people out there in the business world don't have. And it's something that we just innately have, which drew us, I think, to journalism in the first place. And it's a skill that's extremely valuable. And so people have come to me and said, hey, we're struggling with this. They struggle with what we're doing right now, how to look good, how to sound good on a video conference, because that's an unnatural act for most people. It's a very natural thing for you and me, but not for most people. If they're not face to face with someone, they're down over here in the corner, or something like this, or they have bad audio or bad lighting or something.
Or they leave their cat filter on.
I am not a cat. Yeah.
So you've been busy then with that?
Yeah.
Over the last year and a half then, huh?
Surprisingly so. Yeah. And the other thing, Carl, is the great thing about this technology in particular is you can connect with anybody anywhere in the world. And so it makes it just that much easier and broadens the whole potential client base, if you will, of people that I can work with.
Yeah, I had a fun Zoom call about a month ago with my brother and one of my best friends from high school, who's a sportscaster in Australia, and our basketball coach from high school, who's in his 70s now, and
wow.
And another guy too. And we talked for 3 hours, reliving our high school basketball lives and what we've been doing. And one of them was Ed Wyatt, who was the host of PM Magazine. For a while at KGW. That's Ed, and he's in Australia now. So we all did that. So couldn't have done that
great.
without this technology. So the other thing I wanted to tell you, Larry, and there's a little bit of a story that goes into it, but I always felt that a newsrooms needed good leaders, and I'm not talking about the news director. They needed leaders from amongst the working class, I guess. And I've always thought, in coaching basketball, they always say that your best player has to be your hardest worker. If they're not, you're going to have some issues. But I always thought that the anchor of the newscast has to be a good leader, and if they're not, then it's you're all doing your work, and then it's the person on the air. And I always thought Tracy was a great leader. A quiet, subtle leader, and especially for the women in our newsroom, either journalistically, but also just personally. I think if women in our newsroom had issues, they could come to Tracy, and she would help, and she would lead them in a right way. There were other people that I didn't think were great leaders, but I thought you were that person for us for a good 10 years in that newsroom. You weren't the main anchor, but you were that utility infielder guy. But journalistically, if we had some issues, I could come to you, Walden could come to you, anybody would come, and we could talk it out and figure it out and figure where are we going to go with this? Who do we talk to make it go on? And in other issues that went on in our newsroom, you were that stable guy that kind of led us. And we had a real big problem there with an abusive news director for several years. And I thought that your leadership during that, I'm not sure if you were the actual union shop steward.
I was the shop steward at the time.
Was critical for that newsroom surviving.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And, I've always been someone who cared about everybody in an environment. So it's not about the people at the top, it's about everybody, because without the reporters and without the producers and without the editors, you don't have a newscast. And so that was always my attitude. And, I've got this thing, and I guess it's from my upbringing or something, of always wanting to do the right thing and trying to do the right thing on behalf of people. And the union steward job was a perfect opportunity to do that. And we went through some tough times. I was on the forefront of that situation with the bad news director and a variety of other situations. So I appreciate that. And I'm honored that you remember me and think of me that way. And by the way, you mentioned Tracy Berry, and I couldn't agree with you more. She was somebody who was a huge supporter of the union, although it did nothing for her because she had her own personal services contract. She fought a multitude of journalistic battles with news directors and producers about doing the right thing and reporting in the right way. And she always defended the journalistic integrity of our newscasts and our newsroom. And she did it in a, what's that?
The strength of her doing that is she did exactly as you said.
Yeah.
But she did it without the theatrics of look at me, I'm defending this great cause.
Right.
She did it the right way.
Yeah. And my guess is there were probably people in that newsroom who didn't realize the impact that she was having because she was so low key about it. You're right. She didn't boast. She didn't brag. She just went about ensuring to the best of her ability that we were doing the right thing and that we were putting a strong product on the air and that we were treating people well. I don't know if you know that, but that issue we had with that news director who we eventually had walked out the door, she played a huge role in that. And she attended meetings at our lawyer's office, and she was on the forefront of that whole battle.
Yeah, and that's I remember there was a meeting. I mean, we're all working 10-hour days, and we're this I think it's fair to call it abusive, not just to reporters but to everybody in the newsroom.
Right.
We all ended up in Gene Mechanic's office one night so we could figure out where we're going to approach things. And Tracy was there. Other people were not there, but Tracy was there, and I think that gave the group the courage. The courage to step forward and do what was very difficult, was to take a stand against this person with the company. And if she wasn't there, I think we would have had a hard time being successful and going forward. But she gave everybody the courage to step forward, tell their stories, and to set in process. The process was to get this person help so that they could, change their ways. That didn't work, and eventually he was removed for good reason. And if you want more, watch my Walden Kirsch interview, anybody watching, because we talk a little bit more specific about that.
Yeah. So, it's interesting, Carl, because I was the shop steward, so was the de facto, leader on paper, but Tracy was the leader really when it came to, as you said, her influence in that situation and giving us the courage to move forward with it. Because it was a very different situation then than it is now. In fact, I thought after watching your interview with Walden and reliving that, I realized what happened then, if it happened now, that person would have been walked out the door right away. In this current environment, when you're looking at harassment and hostile work environment and all that stuff, there would have been one episode and they'd have probably been out the door. But that went on for weeks and weeks and months.
Yeah. I was this close to leaving. Jill and I had discussed that I can't keep working here if end of this, and we're going to go do something else and stuff like that. And I remember, again, I remember where I was when I walked in the door, the back door, coming up after shooting a story, and there was this bustle, and somebody came up and said, he's fired. The relief. Larry, I told this to Walden, I remember embracing you. I remember I remember us holding each other. I mean, it wasn't going to be tears, but there was such relief and joy that here are two men, probably in their early 40s or whatever, embracing each other like I hadn't embraced a man in my life for years.
Right. Well,
I can still remember your aftershave, Larry. It was that intimate.
Well, we were, boy, you talk about something uniting people behind a common enemy. Boy, that was one. There wasn't a single person, I think, in that newsroom who didn't want that news director to leave. And boy, the emotional toll it took on us, which obviously came out in a really big hug once he was walked out the door.
So, Oh, well, Larry, I haven't seen you in about 3 years. I think you always had that wonderful event at your house for media people once a year. And I think I missed it for 1 year, and then we didn't have it last year because of the pandemic. So I hope that will be replenished here when everybody has their vaccines and we can go do that again. It's always good to see friends, yourself and your wife, Rosie. And if not that, this is a great venue, and I've loved chatting with you, buddy. It's great to relive old memories.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity, Carl. And it's great to catch up with you and see you. And I hope that we can do this less formally, not just the good old days, but stay in touch. And I'll definitely let you know when the next media party occurs. And you got to come over and make sure you attend.
I will do that. And there will be another embrace.
All right.